and welcome again to a next edition of Market uh, content. And today, as a follow-up to the presentation by John Shaw from Peapod Digital Labs, I'm very excited to have two very special people with me today who will discuss the work that international brands need to do prior to coming to the U.S. to situate their brand for retail consumer readiness. And for that, I've got two excellent people from Provisor Marketing. First off, I would like to introduce Julie McPeek. Julie McPeek is a master innovator with over 30 years of experience in sales and marketing. Julie is a big picture thinker who loves a challenge and excels at bringing companies together to make every opportunity a win-win. Julie currently lives in Alexandria, Virginia. Additionally, we have Kate Jones, who also brings over 30 years experience. She is a provisor's guiding force, navigating clients through the nitty-gritty of a project while ensuring that business objectives are met along the way. Kate is passionate about understanding consumer attitudes and behaviors and making sure that those are the center of every brand's business model. Kate lives in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and what I'd like to say is Kate and Julie are the Cornell University dynamic duo. So, Kate and Julie, I know we've known each other for a while, long time. Please welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Wayne.
Okay.
Appreciate you giving that very nice introduction. We have about 45 minutes today to talk to you about preparing your brand for the U.S. market. It's kind of the foundational work that you need to do in order to make sure that you succeed. Give you a little bit of our background and why we're actually talking about this today. Kate and I both came from Procter & Gamble. I spent 18 years there. Kate spent 15 years there. And we really learned to put the consumer at the base of everything that we do from a branding perspective. So at Provisor Marketing, that's really what we do. And we do it for a variety of different types of brands, whether they be small brands or large brands, heritage brands, brands in multiple categories. I think the thing to think about is that this approach is consistent across categories, across brands, across demographic groups. Keep the same approach in mind as you think about preparing your brand for the U.S. market. We are going to talk about a client that we've worked with in the last year that is an international brand that wanted to come to the U.S. market from New Zealand. Health and wellness product. The brand name is BRX. We actually did all the work from, market assessment, consumer research, adjusting the brand business model for the U.S. market, getting it ready for launch. Took about 7 months. They're currently on Target.com, on Amazon, and on their selling off their own website. So we'll weave some examples of this work that we did throughout the business model elements that we talked with you about today. So just know that what we're talking about, we've actually put into practice across multiple clients, one of which is BRX. We're going to talk a little bit today about the consumer, or a lot about the consumer, and how the learning that you get from the U.S. consumer will then be taken into account through all aspects of your business model, from brand positioning to product assortment to retail channel strategy, et cetera. We'll talk about each of those segments in a little more detail, but the key here is to really think about what you need to learn and then how you incorporate that into your business model. We actually have a poll question that we'd like you to answer. And the first question is, have you conducted any research on your products with the U.S. consumer? So whether that is directly with the U.S. consumer, through other partners, have you done any research on the U.S. consumer? Okay, I see people saying they have done a lot of research. They haven't done any consumer research. So I will keep going as these answers come in. I'm glad to see that, a good portion of you have actually done some extensive consumer research, because as you'll see from this discussion we have today, that's kind of the underpinning of everything you're going to do from a U.S. Brand launch strategy standpoint. Let's talk about the U.S. consumer in total. It's a big market. Obviously, that's why you're here. 332 million people in the U.S., but what you'll find is that we really are a true melting pot, probably somewhat different than some of the other markets that you're doing business in. We've done a number of course, we live and die by consumer research. We've done a number of research studies. And one that we did recently was talking to multicultural consumers. Think about those folks as anybody who doesn't identify directly as white Caucasian here in the US. And we asked 125 US multicultural consumers the following question. For most of us in the US, we or our families came from someplace else. Which cultural heritage do you identify with most currently? And you'll see in the pie chart here on the right that in reality, we are truly a melting pot. We've got folks that identify beyond maybe a Hispanic heritage or an African-American heritage to being from South America, Central America, Cuba, Mexico. There's a number of different if you take it one level, below the traditional racial categorizations to heritage. And that just obviously makes this whole target consumer picture a little bit more complex. We also know that 51% of these respondents identify as first or second generation American. So layer on another level of understanding that's important when you think about the US consumer. Obviously, you're not going to be able to reach all 332 million people in the US effectively with the same brand message and the same brand business model. So it's important to understand the distinctions in the US consumer so that you set yourself up for success. Another survey that we ran recently talked about consumer shopping behavior with the pandemic or since the pandemic. And we asked 200 consumers the following question. Throughout the pandemic, we know that many people have had to try a number of different brands because their favorite is not always in stock. We think, of course, actually that's going to continue with supply chain issues. But what we really wanted to know is when restrictions ease up, will you be loyal to your tried and true brand or will you keep looking for new products? And I guess the good news for all of us on this call is that 62% of respondents said they're going to keep trying new brands. And what's interesting is that was especially prevalent with men, with older consumers. Think of that as consumers 35 and older, and Hispanic consumers. So I think the key for you to consider is how can you be ready for that consumer when they're looking for that new brand? We also asked international brands in preparation for this presentation. We asked consumers how they feel about international brands. 200 folks, we asked them, how open are you to trying new consumer brands? Think of those as health food, skincare, wellness, etc., from other countries. And what we found is, again, good news for everybody on this call, 88% of respondents said that they're interested in buying international brands. Now, what you can see from this pie chart is that 29%, the orange pie segment, love to try international brands. And in fact, it's really a treasure hunt for them. That's especially prevalent with Gen X and millennial consumers. Think of that as, 25 to 54 years of age. They really love to try new brands and international brands. And it's really an especially exciting experience for them. So obviously then the next question we asked them was, okay, what's important to you then when you're thinking about international brands? And the bar chart that you see below, obviously quality was number one. The brand has to be what the consumer perceives as a quality brand with quality ingredients. But what we thought was really interesting is that next consumers said, okay, product attributes that are unique to that country of origin are of great interest to them. Actually, even as much or more so than the price value equation. So things like ingredients, things like flavors, unique product attributes that are unique to the country of origin are all things that are of great interest to the US consumer. So think about that uniqueness and how you leverage your uniqueness with the US consumer, because that's of great interest. So when you're thinking about your target consumer here in the US, here are some questions to ask yourself when you think about preparing to be ready to enter the US market. What is the US consumer's job to be done in your category? You know, what are they going to be using this product for? What are their habits and practices with regard to your brand that you need to make sure that you have in mind when you're preparing for market entry? And follow up to that is, what is your product's unique point of difference versus competition? The competition here in the US may be very different than the competition you have in other markets. So understanding what that competition brings to the table and how you're different is important, because you're going to want to leverage your uniqueness with the US consumer. Why should they care about your product? That kind of alludes to the whole idea of your brand story and your authenticity. Jasmine discussed that yesterday in the Next Gen presentation. It's especially important with the Gen Z and the millennial consumer. They really want to know that you're walking the talk. So why should they care? And then how do they buy and use the products in your category? You know, do they shop at drugstores for these? Do they shop online for these types of products? How do they use them, and how often do they use them? What's their purchase frequency? All of those things are going to be important to understand about your US target consumer. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk about how we then use that data that you learn about your target
and when
consumer
we talk brand positioning, really we're talking once again here about the consumer. So we certainly heard from Kevin O'Leary the other day that, you know, being able to present to an investor what your brand is about is really important. We also know it's important to be able to explain it to your customer, to the retail partners, what your brand is about. But we're really focused here about what's most important, and that is how you position your brand specifically to the consumer. And so as Julie said, it's so important that we do the research, and it looks like about 66% of you have done some research, but then the other third haven't done any. And it's really, really important. And we say consumer research, there's data. Someone mentioned in the chat, you know, we've done work with IRI, and IRI is excellent data. It tells you about the category you're in, it tells you about sales trends, but it's a little bit looking in the rear view mirror. So this is what has been selling and what's going on now. Whereas when we talk about consumer research and understanding the consumer, sometimes this gives us a little insight about jobs to be done. What do they need? What do they not have today? And so that's why when we talk about consumer research, we're talking about actually going and identifying who your target is, and then being able to understand how they engage with your category. And this is so important for you to understand before we actually get into developing your brand positioning for the US market. And when we talk positioning, we're talking about your brand name, we're talking about your tagline, and your story. We've heard about this, how important it is that you tell your story. And I think Kevin said it was 29 seconds. We've always used 30 seconds. But what's so hard about it in a way, and challenging, and why consumer insight is so important, is that you have to be able to do it in 30 seconds. So you have to be able to tell your rich story about what makes you different. And when we say story, that's what makes it emotional. So we really want you to be able to explain your brand to US consumers in language they understand, and that will create emotion on their behalf, because we know there's such a strong connection between emotional connection to the brand and brand purchase. So it's really important. You also have to explain what makes you different, how you stand out from the competition. So why consumers should buy you, and then what is unique about your product, maybe that the consumer doesn't need. We have to wrap all of this into your positioning, and it needs to be directed specifically to that unique US consumer who's going to be the purchaser of your brand. And so I am going to launch another, while we move forward and I talk a little bit more about positioning, I am going to launch another survey for you, another poll, which is, do you think right now that your brand's current positioning will be meaningful with the US consumer? So how do you feel your brand would sit with the US consumer now? I'll go ahead and publish that. And I'll keep talking a little bit about the experience that we had working on the BRX, where that was a brand coming in from New Zealand. It actually was 3 different brands. And what we realized was that this product line across 3 different brands was going to be so challenging to bring into the US market. And so we actually had to bring it under one umbrella. So we had to create that overarching brand, but then still distinguish between each category. And it was work that we did specifically talking directly to consumers who use these products, were already in these categories, were interested in our positioning statement when we explained what the brand was about. And they really helped us to identify what our brand name should be. And we're able to go back and test and evaluate our brand name with that consumer. And it was a really positive experience. So what I would encourage you to do, because it says most of you, about almost 80%, are saying, yep, that we actually do have done that work. I would encourage you to continue to do that. And Julie, we can move to the next slide, please. And one example, there are a lot of examples where brands that we've worked on, brands coming into the US, where we've had to make changes to even the brand name and the brand positioning. But here's an example of the reverse of a major global brand from the US going out into an international market, and they even had to change. So when you think about the power and the global impact of a Coca-Cola, but going into the Middle East, Coca-Cola and their tagline, it didn't work with a consumer there. So they did the research. They understood that they needed to make a change. They were able to really hold on to a lot of their core branding elements, but they changed the name and they changed the tagline. And that really drove their business because it wasn't going to resonate the way they talked about it. And I would say for most brands coming into the US, that's what you really need to confirm, is that is the way that I'm talking about my brand today meaningful to the US consumer, and testing it. There are so many tools available now that you can get very fast, immediate feedback from US consumers on your brand positioning, your brand statement, your brand name, et cetera, and all your business model elements. I really encourage everybody to do that. Julie, you want to move to the next slide? So as you're thinking about your brand positioning, what we would encourage you and challenge you to ask is, does your brand story resonate with the US consumer? And have you confirmed that? Have you tested it? Have you asked? What's your point of difference? And does that connect to the consumer's job to be done? Sometimes a product, excuse me, in another country, the job to be done is different here. And so understanding that job to be done and how they talk about it, what's the language they use when they're talking about that category? What the most important things that need to be done, and what is the language that they're using today, so that you can make sure when you launch in the market that you're speaking their language and in a way that's going to be meaningful to them. And then lastly, and this is sort of the technical part, but it's so important, we wanted to call it out because it's important to do early, is just check the US trademark database and make sure that what brand name you have and your taglines, that it's ownable, and the URL as well. Those are 2 areas where often you can go down the pathway, you've got a brand name, but you find out then that it's already trademarked in the US and you have to go in a different direction. So we just recommend that as you're thinking about your positioning, your brand name, your taglines, and your story, that you double check that before you launch into market as well. And then the next area is product assortment. Once again, so incredibly important to understand and ask consumers in your category how they are, what they're using today, and what their expectations are. And this affects every aspect of your brand and your product, and that is the size. So for example, in some regions of the world, the sizes are smaller because trips are more frequent, people are traveling distances, they're not going to carry a larger size product, or because they don't have, they need to have a dollar ring that's lower. In the US, it may be a club size is the right size to be in. Dramatically different based on the consumer in the US, how they're shopping, what their behaviors are. So you really need to understand that and understand what's the right size. And then of course, we heard the other day also that you have to think about what's the impact of that obviously on your manufacturing. So I think we really, Ed Roland mentioned that you really want to think about, don't be opportunistic. You have to really be ready to understand what are the changes I'm going to have to make to my business model based on the US consumer needs to make sure I'm delivering them what they want in the form that they want, and what impact does that have on my manufacturing? Do I have to change my line to make a whole new SKU or acquire new packaging? So very, very important, once again, to think about early on in your planning process as you're developing your brand business model. Product forms are really important. We work with a company, this was a few years ago, that was coming into the US, and they had a pod technology, which was just emerging. The country that they came from, pods was the largest form that people use for doing their laundry. But here it wasn't. It's emerging and it's important, but it's not the largest part of the market. So really understanding what are consumers' habits and practices now in your category, what are they using, and then can you deliver it in the right form that's going to meet the needs of the consumer. And you might have a new form that's going to give them a new way, but then understand there's going to be education required, because if they don't know how to use that new form, you're going to have time for them to get ready for that. Julie mentioned some of the research that we've done also on what's most important to consumers when they're looking at international brands coming into the US. Flavors and ingredients can be really important if they're from country of origin. So that's something to really think about. Do you have a unique flavor or a unique ingredient that you source from your home country that you're able to incorporate into the product? That likely will be very appealing to the consumer, but you need to ask and you need to check and make sure. And then also understanding usage occasions. And so that goes back to sizes. How are they using it? Not only how do they want to buy it and bring it home, how are they using it in their home? How are they storing it in their home? Think about all the way through the consumer experience, from finding and buying your product online or in a store, bringing it home, using the product, and of course, we've heard a lot this week about sustainability, disposing of the product. That'll be something very, very important as well. We'll talk that a little bit more when we get into packaging. Okay, Julie, the next page, please. So here are the questions that we'll want you to ask and test. And so we ask consumers this often in pre-research, then we develop our business model, and we test it again with consumers afterwards. Do your sizes and forms meet the needs of the US consumer, who is your target? Do your flavor profiles or ingredient deck reflect the preferences in the US? We know there are a lot of ingredients that from a regulatory standpoint, you need to check that first, what is and isn't allowed, but also consumer preferences. Where is that heading for what consumers want to have or don't want to have? The X do not have, does not contain, is really important for a lot of consumers. So understanding in your category, what are those consumer requirements? And then which product applications sell best in your category. Once again, IRI data is great for understanding what's selling now, but for figuring out what might sell into the future, that's once again where you may want to complement that with consumer research and consumer insight that'll tell you what might sell into the future if you're solving a problem that isn't being solved today. To the next one, product packaging. We've heard a lot this week about the importance of the product packaging. If it's on shelf or it's online, it's critically important because your package is often the first thing that a consumer will see, and it's what will really identify your product and separate it out from the rest. So it's probably your most important marketing tool is your package design, and understanding what designs that you have now versus what you're going to need to have in the US and what's going to actually appeal most to the US consumer can be very different. It can be dramatically different, or it can be subtly different, where something as simple as a color cue may be different for a consumer in the US than it is outside, or how you're going to emphasize scent, ingredients, efficacy may be different. And being able to understand what it is the consumer's looking for and then incorporate that into your packaging is really, really important. And I think, who was it? It was Brian Gildenberg said, digital marketing is an extension of your package and vice versa. And it's so true. So really, really focusing on your packaging and how you're communicating to consumers and in all the ways that your package design will affect it. So package color, symbols, communications, the form, the actual shape of the product. All of these are really, really important. And being able to ask consumers what their expectations are. Of course, look at the competition as well, because you need to stand out, but really understanding from consumers what their expectations are in your category for the design and the package of the product is really important to do. So here are the questions that we really want you to ask. And I say, look around to some of the product examples that you've seen throughout this week of products that are doing this really, really well. But does your packaging reflect your brand's positioning? Remember, that's where we started. That's that most important starting point. I know my target consumer. I'm able to articulate in my brand story and my brand name and taglines what it's about. Does the package support that and connect to it so that the consumer sees it as seamless and sees the connection. Does it stand out? This is a challenge. Whether you're online or on shelf, you do not want to blend in. You want to stand out. That's really, really important. And we heard that from our retail partners this week. Very, very specifically, Musab Malbali said from Walmart, you really need to make it pop out of the shelf. So how do you do that? You have to go and see what's going on the shelf today and to see how you're going to stand out and how you're going to be different. And is it ownable? Is it something that you can actually patent so that you can have a unique look that you can own on the shelf, in your packaging, and throughout all of your marketing? Really, really important. Probably your package design is the most important elements that you need to consider in making sure that that resonates with a consumer. And it's another area that there are so many tools where you can develop different options, share it with your target consumer, and allow them to provide you feedback. So often when Julie and I have done this with our clients, I have an idea in my mind of what I think is the right packaging design. I'm sure they've nailed it. But the consumer saying, hey, I understand your positioning, I understand what you're about, but I like this design better. And it's much more important that your target consumer connects to your design than one individual who's on the team. So we really, really encourage you to make sure you use tools to be able to validate that the work that you're doing on your marketing throughout, but with your packaging particularly, resonates with the consumer. And Julie, back to you.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the last two parts of the brand business model that you need to take into consideration. There's been a lot of discussion about commerce strategy. Ed Rowland on Tuesday talked a lot about the different retail options here in the US. And the way we are going to approach it today is based on, of course, the consumer. Where does the consumer expect to find your product from a commerce strategy? Now, when we say commerce, we mean anywhere that the consumer can exchange money for your product. So think about it in that context. What you see here is a chart that was included in an IRI presentation in the first quarter of 2021 that looked at, okay, we've seen some market changes in the way consumers are shopping for products because of the pandemic. And, what has that done to where people are shopping from an e-commerce standpoint, order online, pick up in store, and then going into brick and mortar. And we've heard a lot about the tremendous growth in e-commerce. And of course, because of the pandemic, that trend has just accelerated over the last year. But the takeaway that I got from this chart is that brick and mortar is still a very important part of the purchase decision here in the United States. So the consumer has a lot of different options in terms of places where they can go to exchange money for your product. And you need to keep all of those in mind as you plan for market entry here in the US. I do have one last poll that we're going to execute. And this is, do you know where and how the consumer makes purchase decisions about your products in the US, about your brand category? And we'll see. So it looks like some of you, yes, you have a good feel for it. Some of you know. So let's talk about that a little bit then here in terms of questions you need to be asking yourself. I'm not going to go through all the retail channels and that sort of thing because folks have obviously done that before here. But when you think about giving the consumer a seat at your table, how do you think about that in the context of your commerce strategy? So think about, how does the consumer expect to find your product? Where do they expect to find your product? And here in the US, like other markets I'm sure you're doing business in, the opportunities are pretty vast. From an e-commerce standpoint, Ed spoke yesterday about Amazon, but also about some of the up-and-comers like Walmart.com and Target.com. There's a lot of this social commerce going on here now, not to where China is, of course, but there's a lot of this live shopping event sort of thing happening on Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook, etc. So those are all e-commerce considerations in addition to perhaps your own site where you're going to do direct to consumer. And then there's the wealth of brick and mortar outlets. While there are, obviously big retailers that do a good portion of business here in the US, like Walmart and Target, Walgreens, CVS, there are some other retail channels that can be very influential from a branding standpoint. So if you have a beauty product, being in Ulta, a beauty superstore, is pretty important because it really credentials your brand with the consumer. It makes the consumer feel like, okay, yes, it is a valid beauty brand and it's one that I should consider. You also have an opportunity to communicate with the consumer a little bit more directly because that shopping occasion is a little bit longer than it might be in the beauty category at a Walmart store. The other thing to consider is, where does the consumer expect to find your brand in store? We've worked with a brand that is an eye care brand, and they have got a new product that it addresses eye health and sleep health. So in that circumstance, does the consumer expect to shop for it in nutritional supplements? Do they expect to find it in the sleep category, or do they expect to find it in eye health? So you can see that if you make the wrong decision, it could clearly affect your business. So that's why it's important to understand where the consumer expects to find it in store. And then kind of a natural outgrowth of your commerce strategy is this idea of price value equation. Does your price that you're charging at retail reflect your brand positioning? So if you have a luxury brand, sometimes if your price is too low, the consumer can perceive that to mean that it's not a quality product. And so that's why it's so important that that price reflect your brand positioning and your brand's position in the commerce channel, the retail channel that it's going to be at. So all of that kind of intertwines to reinforce your brand with the consumer where they expect to find it. You know, this was especially important when we were talking about the New Zealand brand, because we had several different product categories with several different problems and solutions and usage occasions. So the commerce strategy that we put together for that had to take into account, you know, where the consumer expected to find each of the subsegments and where our brand positioning of natural, B ingredients, et cetera, would resonate with the consumer, and, you know, the section they expect to find it in. So it is a bit of a matrix, but important as you think about reaching your consumer with your brand's message in the appropriate place. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about marketing strategy. As Ed Rowland mentioned on Tuesday, you know, it can be very expensive to market here in the US. You know, that's probably something else that you think about with regard to commerce strategy, is that going directly to Walmart can be very expensive, probably not the first step you want to take unless you have a multi-million-dollar branding budget. Marketing strategy is important because you can do a great job getting your brand on the shelf at the retailers here in the US, but if you don't educate the consumer about your product positioning, brand attributes, et cetera, and where they can find it, it will sit on the shelf. So you have to be able to help the retailer by pulling it off the shelf into the consumer's baskets. Now, what's challenging is that there are a lot of choices here to reach the consumer with your brand message. What you see here actually is an example of a brand that we worked with a few years ago, where the consumer is a Gen Z millennial consumer, and there are ways to reach them effectively both online and offline. But that what's important is that your brand message needs to be reflected consistently through all of those. So think about where the consumer expects to find information about your brand, what influences their purchase, and specifically within the funnel purchase cycle, what are the most effective tools through that funnel to communicate your brand story, your brand's attributes, and any, you know, promotional aspects that you want the consumer to consider when it comes to purchasing your brand here in the US. This is an example of some research we actually did on a food brand, and it was really so interesting because, of course, some of the things that you might use, the tools that you might use with food products are very different than tools you might use with wellness products, healthcare products, and beauty products. So in this case, some of the things that influences purchase decisions in the food category are obviously recommendations by family and friends, but also then tasting and sampling and being able to experience the brand. We also know that's important in the beauty care business, where we, samples that consumers can try can influence purchase. So understanding all of the attributes that are important, all of the vehicles that are important, is crucial when you're putting together your marketing strategy. The other thing that's interesting is that the dynamics of the consumer influence that as well. You see on the right here that, age groups are influenced differently, genders are influenced differently, and ethnicities are influenced differently. So those unique attributes to the marketing tactics that resonate with each subsegment will be important to understand. There's a lot of ways to influence trial, and you can pick and choose ones that are most effective with your target consumer. It's going to vary depending on your consumer and your category. So here are some of the questions I want you to ask yourself about marketing strategy. Of course, it all begins with your brand's budget, right? Very few of us have the luxury of spending what Procter & Gamble spends on marketing. Now, I'm here to tell you that you don't have to spend multi-millions of dollars, but you can scale according to what your objectives are, what your budgets are, and who you're trying to reach. And so it's a little bit of a puzzle that you put together, all of course with the underpinning of consumer research. Who and what influences your target consumers' purchase decisions? These days, that influencer piece has taken on a new meaning. And we've got any number of influencers depending on what the product and the category is. We have, beauty editorials. We have, of course, friends and family. We have healthcare practitioners. We have estheticians and dermatologists. So it all kind of depends on what your product is and how the consumer finds out, most importantly, finds out what they're going to buy in that category. What are their media habits? Some folks are very influenced by Instagram. Others love TikTok. Video is kind of king these days. So where can you interject video into your communication with the consumer? And then, from a media standpoint, is video on YouTube enough? Do you think about connected television? Do they listen to Spotify? So those are all considerations when you're putting together your marketing strategy. And then Ed mentioned it yesterday, as did a number of the retailers. Is the category highly promoted? I listened to the Bed Bath & Beyond discussion, and he said, listen, we are about bed and bath. We're less about beyond right now. So clearly promotional spending will be very important in any product line that is associated with bed and bath. On Amazon, they have some terrific marketing tools that you can use to raise awareness of your brand on their platform. All of those are things to consider when you're marketing to your consumer in those retail channels. Now, that was important for us when we considered the New Zealand brand, because we were talking to subsegments of consumers, all who were really interested in natural solutions, clean label solutions, the ingredients that were uniquely New Zealand, but they were influenced slightly differently depending on what their problem solution was. So it was a bit of a marketing matrix that we had to put together in order to make sure we effectively communicated the brand's point of difference, story, etc. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Kate to give you some kind of do's and don'ts considerations for market entry with the U.S.
So this is really a summary of the data that we've shared and the perspective that we've shared on how important it is really as you're getting your brand ready to launch in the U.S. or growing your brand in the U.S. If you're in the U.S. and you're looking to grow further, these apply as well, which is do your research, do your specific target consumer research. It's great to rely on other resources that you can find by search or by buying other reports, but doing very, very specific research on your category consumer is so important, and it's absolutely the place to start so that you can then understand their habits and practices, see how your brand can best meet their needs, and then also to keep them involved throughout the process. So it's just so important. We can't miss, obviously, all the regulatory, technical, trademark elements are really important also to do early on. But you really want to do all of that research so you have a strong understanding of the U.S. market, what are the requirements, and then what are the sort of unique habits and practices of the consumers in your category, and who might your target be as a very unique user. And then throughout the work of developing your U.S. brand business model, give the US consumer a seat at your table. And when we say that, check in with them. Find a way to create a community of potential users who can give you feedback. There are a lot of resources that allow you to do that in the US right now, leveraging AI and leveraging platforms that consumers are engaged with. But make sure you find a way that you're not sitting around with all of the folks that work at the company, love the product, love what you do, and that you're talking to yourselves about how you should go to market. You have to make sure that that end consumer, because at the end of the day, that's where the money's coming from. So all the money we talk about making it in the US, it comes out of a consumer's pocket, then goes through to you, whether it's through a retailer or however whatever your commerce strategy is. But it's so important. And so throughout your development process, checking in with the consumer to make sure, and especially before you're making any major investments in a new package or in a new design work, make sure you've got the consumer right there with you and that you're checking with them to make sure that as you're making decisions, that they're validating that for you and that it's going to resonate then with them once it hits the shelf or is online. Do not presume that the demand for your brand in the US will be the same as other countries around the globe. We know this. It's so different. Every country is totally different. We know from working on brands that come from the US, outside of the US, that have tried to take their business model and just put it elsewhere, does not work. From package size to brand names to taglines to storytelling, all of it is different. And so you really need to be aware that you're going to have to make changes to your brand as you're coming into the US. Don't assume that all the US 330 million and growing are the same. They're very, very different. But at the same time, most of us can't afford to reach all of them. So that's a positive, but it's finding who are those consumers that are most likely to buy my product and how do I communicate to them? And being able to really hone in on that is so important. Some of the charts and graphs that Julie showed, doing your homework on understanding, what are their influencers in this specific category, in your category, not just in general, because it will vary by category on who they rely on for information and for influence and how they make their decisions and their choices, all the way through all of their experience with buying the product, bringing it home, using the product, and then hopefully coming back and repurchasing. So spend the time and really know that consumers are not all the same. And please do not assume that it's easy money. It really requires investment in the US market. It's large. There are a lot of consumers here, but making sure your business will win here does take investment, and you need to be prepared for that as well. So what to include in your US retail pitch? We wanted to kind of reinforce here that all the work you're doing to help build your brand will be extremely important to share with your retailers as you're going out into the marketplace. So your consumer insights, your real research data, that's valued by retailers. When you're sitting in a call and you can say, I've talked to consumers in this category, I understand them, and you have data to prove that, and then to support the choices that you've made in your business model, extremely important. Because everybody believes that their product is going to be a winner. But when you can confirm with the US consumer and you have data that validates the choices you've made around your positioning, your packaging, all the choices you made, that's really important to share with the retailer. Making sure that you understand US category trends. We talked about IRI data, syndicated data, so important to incorporate into your presentation as well. Really being able to provide, sometimes we call this the sort of the white coat, making sure that you can really support the reason to believe for your product, where it comes from, because this is the part that they may not know. So really having data and support on your product, what's unique about it, and then any experts that you have behind it really can be helpful as well. A tailored brand business model for each retailer. As you go out into the retail and you choose which retail partners would be best partners for you, how do you think about your business model? What might you do uniquely, not only from potentially your marketing strategy, which can be unique through trade promotion, but also through your marketing strategy, but what other elements of your business model maybe would be unique? Maybe it is a unique package, a unique exclusive offering that you would do. So really thinking through how you tailor your business for the retail partners could be really important as well. Product mock-ups, actually having samples and products mocked up in the way we found was really, really important, a requirement. If your product isn't ready to go, you're not ready to meet with a retailer. You've got to have that ready to go and to be able to show them what you've got and that they trust, especially in today's world of all the product supply issues. They need to be very, very confident that the business model you've developed is ready to go before they make any decisions. So it's really important to have done your homework, be ready, have your product ready to go for the retailers when you go out into market. And then also being able to really project what your business is going to do at each retailer and each segment. And that also comes from not only your syndicated data, but marrying that up with your unique consumer data, because you'll be able to get purchase intent data out of your consumer research that you can then overlay to say, we can project what kind of business we think we're going to do in the marketplace. All very important for you to have in developing a successful business model. Very important also as you work with partners to go out and actually present to the US retail market. So how do we do this work, and how do we usually get started? So we always start with consumer research, understanding and digging in to find out what do we know about consumers in this category, and then understanding who the competition would be, what the market analysis is, pulling all of that data together, understanding our own capabilities. And then with all of that data in place, we develop that business model. And then once again, we go back and we check with the consumer to make sure as we're making significant choices about direction to go with our brand, that we're checking that in with the consumer. But this is how we usually do work, how we recommend that you make sure all of these components are available to you as you're developing your business model for the US market. And I think we have landed exactly at 45 minutes. Oh, I think we just went over by a minute, but I think we left about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I assume Wayne might jump back in here and have curated some questions for us.
Yeah, so first off, Julie and Kate, I really appreciate what you guys have outlined today. This is 4 years of marketing expertise, a curriculum that you guys have put forward that is outstanding. And I really do appreciate the honesty and transparency that you've put forward in helping these suppliers understand how to ready their brand for US market entry. So really terrific presentation. And, you know, as I'm listening to you, thinking that I know a lot about this stuff, my head is spinning. So really, you know, it's not easy, it's not simple, which is why experts like you are so important to help decipher and make sense of really big opportunities that sometimes aren't necessarily so easy. So thank you for that. Outstanding. So, yep, sure. So let's go to the questions. So, you know, one question that I think is being asked here, and you know, for a small manufacturer, and we've heard about data so many times throughout the week, data, data, data. Data is the new currency. How does a small supplier, let's go over this again. What are the things that a small supplier can do to get data about their product? I can't afford MRI, I can't afford Nielsen, I don't have access to the retailer on a day-to-day basis. How do I access data? Could we just spend a little time on that again, please?
Sure. I'll start with this, and I'm sure Kate will jump in. So, you know, there's several different forms of data, right? If you work with a company like the Emerson Group, they have got data that they buy and they use when they're managing the brands on behalf of their clients. So there's that sort of data. Usually it's market basket, sometimes syndicated data. Of course, there's the consumer research data that you have. When we do the research studies that are kind of quick, down and dirty research, you get data tables that talk about, you know, okay, who are the folks that are answering that, yes, they'd love to buy this brand, or who are giving you verbatims that talk about why they might like it or why they might not like it. So you have that sort of data that all of that you can use when you're making projections. We also have bought one-time data purchases from IRI or Nielsen or Spins that gives you kind of a snapshot of that moment in time about your category and your brand. And then many times, if you search online, there are, you know, interesting reports that are white papers or, you know, free data that certain organizations like Statista will give you to kind of entice you to buy membership. So there's a number of different data sources that we have used that many times you cobble together to tell you the full story. Kate, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would jump in on the consumer side as well. This is another area where you can spend a lot of money to do consumer research, and you know that we believe that it's really, really important and worth the investment. But there are emerging tools based on AI that allow you to get out to consumers with omnibuses or with really quick. There are platforms out there that allow you to reach consumers really quickly and fairly inexpensively. I mean, instead of spending, call it $50,000 US, maybe you could spend $3,000 to $5,000 US to validate your consumers. So I think there are new tools that are also emerging, Wayne, when it comes to consumer research that you can use. So it's kind of always keeping your eye open. Also, we're always looking to find, because most of our clients are working on tight budgets, and so we're always looking for the most efficient way. We have a lot of great partners that we work with that do that bring us different research solutions as well. So there are solutions emerging that are less expensive than, call it, your traditional. The other important factor is they're fast. So you used to spend a lot on traditional research, but if you don't get the answers for 6 months or even 4 to 6 months, the world has changed already. So using some of these tools that are a little faster, a little bit more nimble, is what Julie and I find ourselves doing much more often now.
Great, thank you. Very important. Again, I mean, how many times do we hear the importance of data? And again, you guys offer some great suggestions on how smaller suppliers can access that. I do want to just make a call out to the Australian Trade Commission. Thank you both so much. This was one of the best presentations of the week. I know we had a lot of content this week, and it's not even over yet, but thank you for that comment, Australia Trade Commission. Certainly, I think your members have an opportunity in maybe connecting in with Provisor. Okay, let's just see what else we have here. Julie, Kate, any suggestions regarding CBD? The question for roll-on and tincture, but what's your general perspective on how we can approach CBD in the U.S. market for local suppliers, but also for international suppliers? What is your thought there?
Yeah, I think it's really important. We've heard throughout the week, and I thought it was interesting hearing from some of the retailers who feel like, in some cases, because of state by state different regulations, they might be a little hesitant on getting into CBD, but there's always a little concern also about how the efficacy of CBD. So I think there's a really great opportunity for brands to be able to validate their efficacy and make sure that you have data that supports that. And then just looking at the ever, emerging market. I mean, it's clearly still an emerging market, but it's very crowded. So I think really doing your research and understanding what's going on, who's the competition that's out there, see how they're doing, what's going on. I think it's really important to take a pulse check on that. It's definitely emerging, but I think it's seeing some challenges.
Yeah, I was going to say we've done a little bit of consumer research in this area, and what we do know is that there is a consumer that is very interested in all things CBD here in the U.S. And so to Kate's point, understanding how you differentiate from the many other CBD brands here in the U.S. is really important, and making sure it's meaningful to the consumer is also important. It's a little bit here like, you're meeting several different masters because of, the 50 states having different regulations, and it's more of a surgical approach as opposed to, a broad scale market launch per se.
Okay. Another question here, curious to know your perspective. So we launched a brand, but now we have version 2 coming out, which is improved version. So do I keep the name of the first brand, or do I change the name with the improved version?
Well, general rule of thumb is it's hard to build 2 brands versus 1. And if you've already done the work to build the 1 brand, I would consider either just, transitioning to the new product. Maybe the new product has different, habits and practices it needs, or, you could call it Ultra or Luxe or something like that. I'd need to know more about the brand, but I generally don't think it's a good idea to introduce multiple brands, because now you've kind of split your funds over 2 different places, cost centers, if you will.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think it depends on, are you looking at a totally new consumer of the product? So if it's a new consumer, once again, to Julie's point, it's expensive to build another brand. So my first gut reaction would always be, no, don't just build a new brand because you have a new. Rather, think about your brand hierarchy, what we call the architecture of your brand, and is there a way to create it so you have your core? We're actually working on a project right now where it's I have a core user, but then I kind of have a pro user. And so what they're doing is they're distinguishing. They have the brand name, but then they're going to have different sort of parts of the business that address different consumer needs. So I would kind of think about your product, what the new the new capabilities are, and then how does that sort of design to the consumer groups if it's a different consumer. But yeah, I think building a new brand it's expensive, and then you're not able to benefit from the overall kind of brand recognition.
Okay, I know we have time for one more, but the amount of time we have for this one more is not going to necessarily be enough time. So the question is sustainability in packaging. What do you mean by sustainability in packaging? I thought it was interesting yesterday when Tom Sacchi talked about developing your brand from the end, right? Not from the beginning, but from the end of life cycle. Very interesting dynamic and how we should think about that. But in a minute or two, Julie, Kate, can you just give a perspective about sustainable packaging? It seems to be a very important topic in the retailer's mind today. Just give us your quick perspective.
Kate, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. I mean, I think, we think sustainability, it's really, you want to think about it from your whole brand persona. It will be really important to understand, how does your consumer value sustainability? So that's step one. Understanding how your consumer would define sustainability would be super important. When I think packaging sustainability, it's all around how do you reduce kind of your impact on the world. And when we think about the wonderful presentation on TerraCycle, that was just kind of mind-blowing when you think about all the different aspects of your product and the impact it has on the environment and the world. So it might be your package itself. So one of the first things we all saw was products that were packaged in a package. So I have a package, but then I have a box, and my package is in a box. Well, the box is great because it allows me to communicate more, but that's a whole bunch of waste. That as soon as I get home, that thing goes in the trash. So that's not sustainable. So that's adding, how do you think about structuring the product and your packaging so that it's as sustainable as possible, it's using as least packaging as possible, and all the way through the life cycle. So what happens to the consumer? How do they use it up, and what do they do when they're done? Because this is how consumers are looking at packaging, but also from your ingredients. I mean, how are you acquiring your ingredients? Is there a sustainability story there? And it really goes back into every aspect. But I think you really want to make sure that you can kind of answer honestly to your consumers, are you working diligently to make sure you're making a positive impact on the environment?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing. I think the important thing here is that there's the retailer, right? So that's important to the retailer. And then there's the consumer component. And you better make sure that if you're going to hang your hat on sustainability, that you've done your homework so that you have sustainability as kind of an underpinning of your brand from beginning to end, because you can have a great sustainable package, but if you don't have sustainable farming practices, you better bet that there's a U.S. consumer that will figure that out. So remember, think about authenticity with regard to really using sustainability as a brand platform.
Yeah, guys, I know we have 3 minutes left. There was something that just popped in my mind, just regarding, storytelling and purpose-driven brands and how that even may play from an international brand coming overseas, and what is the equity with that purpose-driven story from a global perspective resonating here in the United States, which probably sounds like another opportunity. But we only have 2 minutes left. I know that Julie and Kate are accessible. Their contact information is on the that little people icon that you see. They will welcome questions or conversation. You can connect to them via email or on LinkedIn. I personally have known these two ladies for probably 20 years and deliver high quality, best practice, best in class marketing approaches for brands, emerging small brands that are looking to break in and grow. So, Julie and Kate, it's always a pleasure. I appreciate your time and involvement with our global market, and clearly look forward to our next touch point.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you.